Regaining consciousness in the intensive care unit, the wealthy man overheard his wife's conversation on the phone. Upon learning about the will, he decided to feign unconsciousness. Samuel woke abruptly, as though an invisible switch had been flipped, forcing his mind awake, even though his body refused to cooperate. Slowly cracking his eyes open, he squinted against the harsh, white light of the room. Where am I? And why does my body feel so weak, so powerless? How did I even get here? He muttered, his voice barely audible. His question was answered indirectly by faint squeaks from the medical devices a few meters away. Straining his hazy thoughts, Samuel realized he was in a hospital room. But how? And what had happened? The blinding overhead light disrupted his focus, while a persistent buzzing in his ears felt like a blaring alarm echoing in his head. Sharp pain suddenly sliced through his consciousness, making him groan softly. An intense thirst overcame him, but there was no one nearby to bring him water, and nothing was within arm's reach. As his eyes adjusted, he noted the abundance of medical equipment surrounding him. Samuel had never been in such a place before and had no frame of reference. IV lines snaked from his hands and sensors clung to his skin. His body felt weightless, utterly detached from his usual vitality. He didn't have the strength to open his eyes fully, so he observed the world through slits. At first, the muffled sounds around him seemed distant, almost non-existent. For a moment, Samuel doubted his ability to hear properly, but then a voice reached his ears, one he recognized instantly. It was his wife, Clara. Her familiar intonation and slight lilt in pronouncing certain words confirmed it was her. Samuel's heart fluttered, a mix of hope and apprehension. He tensed, willing his body to signal her in some way, but then he heard the door open. The businessman braced himself for anything, but Clara's words shattered him. "Dr. Monroe," Clara began, her voice tinged with feigned concern. "Tell me, how is my husband? Will he remain like this, vegetative for long? Should we consider more radical measures?" Her tone turned plaintive, dripping with insincerity. A tense pause followed before the doctor responded, her voice firm yet calm. "Mrs. Hastings, I'll give you one piece of advice. Don't tempt fate. Hope for the best. Your husband's chances are slim, but you mustn't give up. And I strongly advise spending less time in his room to avoid inadvertently exposing him to infection. We will notify you of any progress, but for now, I suggest you step away." Clara sighed dramatically. "Of course, you're right. I understand. Forgive me for being overly emotional," she said, her saccharine tone grating. Shortly after, Samuel heard the fading sound of her footsteps and the soft click of the door closing. It seemed Dr. Monroe had left, leaving Clara alone by his bedside, lost in thought. Moments later, the melodious trill of a phone broke the eerie silence. Its unnatural sound made Samuel question whether he was dreaming. He had always considered eavesdropping beneath him, a shameful act unworthy of his status as the owner of one of the city's finest restaurants. If he were healthy, Samuel would have left the room to let Clara speak in private. But trapped in his own body, he had no choice but to listen. "Hello, darling," Clara said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Is that you? Your number seems different again. Did you change it?" She giggled softly. "A will? Yes, it's done. Everything is prepared. As we discussed, it's exactly as I wanted. The notary reviewed it, but of course, it wasn't free. You know how it is. But it's all worth it, don't you think?" Samuel's heart pounded furiously. His wife was speaking far too affectionately. Who was on the other end of the line? And what was this talk about a will? The implications struck Samuel like a lightning bolt. She's not even speaking clearly, just whispering. Is that possible? And what exactly is she talking about? This will? Samuel thought, confusion and dread creeping into his mind. But what Clara said next erased all doubts. "Yes, darling, I just came into the room. Well, what can I say? He's lying there like a vegetable. No changes. At this rate, I think I'll be able to manage the restaurant however I please. And when Samuel is gone, I'll inherit it, just as it should be. All right, I have to go now. So many things to take care of. Love you. Bye for now." The audacity of her words left Samuel breathless. How could she talk about his death so casually, and in his presence, no less? She even called him a vegetable. Did he truly deserve such coldness and disrespect? Lying immobile in the hospital bed, Samuel's thoughts churned. Why hadn't the sensors, designed to alert the staff to his regained consciousness, activated? He'd seen something like this in a movie once. The memory was faint, but the scenario stuck in his mind. Still, it was one thing to watch such events unfold on screen, and another to be the victim of betrayal in real life. There was no doubt now, Clara had betrayed him. But amidst the anger and hurt, another question loomed. Who had saved him from the fiery car crash? Who had risked their own life for his? His mind, clouded with fatigue and pain, drifted back to that fateful day. That morning had started like any other. Samuel Whitaker, owner of the elite Montclair Bistro, awoke early, as he always did. The first rays of sunlight painted the city's skyline in hues of gold and rose, a view he cherished from the expansive windows of his hillside home. While most of Seaford City was still dozing, Samuel had already prepared his simple but nutritious breakfast. Freshly squeezed orange juice and a quick plate of eggs with sautéed vegetables. Afterward, he spent a few minutes stretching and doing light exercises to invigorate his body. A proponent of healthy living, he had long embraced vegetarianism, but respected others' dietary choices, including Clara's preference for meat. With his breakfast finished, Samuel stepped out onto the enclosed terrace. Winter's chill hung in the air, but the warmth of the small fireplace crackling in the corner made the space cozy. He sipped his juice, enjoying the serenity of the morning while mapping out his plans for the day. Clara was still asleep as usual. Samuel often found himself feeling lonely during these quiet mornings, though he never said it aloud. After breakfast, he dressed sharply in his favorite tailored suit and headed to work. Arriving early at Montclair Bistro was a habit of his. It allowed him to ensure everything was running smoothly and to observe which employees showed up on time and who was late. He valued punctuality but was understanding of unavoidable circumstances, like those of Rosa, the dishwasher. Rosa lived across town, relying on an unreliable bus route to commute to work. Samuel was well aware of the challenges she faced, especially on days when the weather disrupted Seaford's usual rhythm. And on that particular day, the city was blanketed by an unexpected snowstorm. The snow had started gently, swirling like tiny dancers in the breeze. But as the morning wore on, the storm intensified, quickly covering the rooftops in thick, white layers. Samuel loved this kind of weather, though he knew it meant fewer customers would brave the blizzard for a night out. Samuel pulled up the collar of his coat and stepped out into the biting wind, leaving the warmth of his car behind. A sharp gust hurled snow into his face, making him shiver and quicken his pace toward the restaurant. Outside, Walter, the elderly janitor, was already busy with his shovel, clearing the steps before anyone could arrive. Seeing Samuel approach, Walter raised a gloved hand in greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker. Snow's really coming down today. Looks like it'll keep at it. This kind of cold really gets into your bones." "Good morning, Walter," Samuel replied. "Are you out here battling the snow alone again?" "I told Leo to help you during storms like this," he said, referring to the security guard. Walter waved him off with a chuckle. "Don't worry about me, sir. I've got this. It's like a workout. Keeps me feeling young." "A few swings of the shovel and I'm good as new." Samuel laughed. "A workout, you say? Well, hand it over then. I could use a warm-up myself." Despite Walter's protests, Samuel took the shovel and began clearing the steps. Passers-by looked on in amazement as the sharply dressed owner of the Bayview Grill worked the snow-covered stairs with practiced ease. Walter nodded in admiration. "You're pretty handy with that shovel, Mr. Whitaker. Where'd you pick up the skill?" Samuel smiled. "Back at my grandfather's place in Fairmount. Winters there were brutal, snow everywhere, sometimes covering the windows completely. We had no choice but to dig ourselves out. Hunting wasn't my thing, but I loved foraging for mushrooms, berries, and going fishing. Winters always meant shoveling first thing in the morning." Walter listened with interest, his respect for Samuel growing even more. He had always admired Samuel's kindness and humility, qualities rarely found in men of his status. Samuel had stood up for Walter on more than one occasion, especially when Leo, the administrator, got too big for his boots. "Speak of the devil," Leo's voice called out from behind. "Mr. Whitaker, what on earth are you doing out here? You'll catch your death of cold. We can't afford to lose you." Samuel turned to meet Leo's gaze, easily recognizing the forced flattery in his tone. "It's nothing, Leo. I'm not fragile. Now tell me, how's everything going inside? Are the supplies in order? Is the staff all present? At the mention of staff, Leo winced, his expression as sour as if he'd bitten into a lemon. Everything's fine except for the kitchen staff. What's her name? Rosa, I think. No matter how many times she's late, she always has an excuse, he grumbled. Samuel frowned and handed the shovel back to Walter. Leo, you know Rosa has 4 children to look after, all on her own. I've also asked you not to refer to her as kitchen staff, so dismissively. She's part of the team, and we call her by name. Respect is the foundation of any good workplace. Without it, you can't build a team that functions properly. Samuel's tone was sharp, leaving Leo visibly rattled. The administrator glanced nervously at Walter, who couldn't hide the grin spreading across his face. Leo's humiliation was evident, but his mind churned with resentment. One day, Leo thought bitterly, one day, we'll get rid of him. Then I'll run things my way. Let him play the hero for now. At that moment, a hunched figure emerged from the swirling snow. Rosa, bundled in an oversized coat, hurried toward the restaurant. Snow clung to her boots and hemline as she trudged forward, her movements sluggish but determined. Well, Leo sneered. Here comes Rosa. What's it this time? Did the bus break down again, or is it a new excuse today? Samuel's sharp gaze silenced Leo immediately. Enough, Leo, that's uncalled for, he said curtly, before turning his attention to Rosa. She stopped in front of him, breathless, and apologized, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitaker. The buses were delayed because of the snow. I tried my best to find another way here. Samuel's expression softened. No need to apologize, Rosa. It's not your fault. Now, head inside and warm up, and don't rush. You're here, and that's what matters. As Rosa moved past him toward the entrance, she slipped on the icy steps. Samuel quickly reached out to steady her. Careful, he said gently, holding her arm. Thank you, Rosa murmured, her cheeks reddening, though whether it was from the cold or embarrassment, she couldn't tell. Take it slow, and Leo, Samuel added, his voice carrying a note of finality. Sprinkle some salt on these steps, will you? Let's make sure no one else slips. Leo nodded, muttering under his breath as Samuel helped Rosa safely into the warmth of the restaurant. Walter, watching the scene unfold, chuckled to himself. That man has a good heart, he thought. Taking Rosa's hand, Samuel helped her up the remaining steps. Her small, bare hand felt surprisingly warm against his. But then, something strange happened. Rosa gasped audibly and yanked her hand away as if she'd been burned. Are you hurt? Samuel asked, startled. Rosa avoided his eyes, clutching her hand tightly. No, it's nothing. I'm sorry, it's not your fault. It must have been my imagination, she stammered, her voice trembling. Samuel frowned, trying to understand. Did I grip your hand too tightly? I didn't mean to. No, it wasn't that, Rosa interrupted quickly, shaking her head. But the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Confused and concerned, Samuel followed her inside, where he caught up with her in the hallway. Speaking quietly to avoid drawing attention, he asked, Rosa, what's going on? Why did you react like that? She stopped in her tracks, her shoulders tensing. Turning to face him, she hesitated before finally answering, I'm sorry, Mr. Whitaker. It's because of my visions. Visions? Samuel repeated, his brow furrowing. Rosa nodded, her face pale. Yes, the ones that come true. Premonitions, I guess you'd call them. Samuel blinked, unsure how to respond. What do you mean? When did this start? Rosa hesitated, then lowered her gaze. Back in school, I fell during gym class, hit my head pretty hard. After that, strange things started happening. I'd see things, and later they'd happen exactly as I saw them. He crossed his arms, his skepticism obvious. And what exactly did you see just now? Tears welled up in Rosa's eyes as she whispered, A car accident. Your car. It's dark green, isn't it? The moment I touched your hand, I knew it was going to happen. But it won't be your fault, it'll be someone close to you. Her voice cracked with emotion. Samuel stared at her in disbelief. That's ridiculous, he said after a moment. No offense, Rosa, but I don't believe in predictions or premonitions. Life doesn't work that way. Rosa looked at him with quiet resignation. I understand, Mr. Whitaker, but please just consider not driving for a while, just in case. He forced a reassuring smile. Rosa, I've been driving for over a decade without incident. I always follow the rules and never speed. There's no reason to worry. Rosa nodded reluctantly, though her expression remained troubled, as if she could already see the wheels of fate turning. All right, Samuel said gently. Get back to work, and don't let this weigh on you. By the way, how are your kids? If you need anything, just let me know. I'm happy to help however I can. Thank you, Whitaker, Rosa replied softly. The kids are fine, but actually, I do need your permission for something. What is it? Samuel asked, his tone warm and inviting. Rosa hesitated for a moment, gathering her courage. Mr. Whitaker, I wanted to ask for your permission, she said softly. Samuel nodded, his tone encouraging. Of course, Rosa. What do you need? Taking a deep breath, she explained, I was hoping I could take home some of the dishes that customers leave untouched, just one or two. I can pay for them if needed, or you could deduct it from my salary. It would really help me and the kids. Samuel smiled warmly. There's no need to pay for them, Rosa. Those dishes are just going to be thrown away anyway. Take as many as you need. I'm happy to know they'll be put to good use. The gratitude in Rosa's eyes was unmistakable. Thank you so much, Mr. Whitaker. This means the world to us. Don't mention it, Samuel replied. Take care of yourself and the little ones. Rosa hurried off to her duties, a spring in her step, while Samuel returned to his office. There he resumed his usual tasks, approving menus with the restaurant manager, coordinating with suppliers, and preparing for the upcoming inspection. Yet every so often, Rosa's peculiar warning about the car accident crept back into his thoughts. Can you believe it? A kitchen worker with visions. That's a first for me, Samuel mused. But he quickly pushed the notion aside, focusing on the immediate concerns of running the restaurant. The day wore on, and by mid-afternoon, the snowstorm had started to subside. The city's maintenance crews had worked swiftly, clearing most of the main roads. With an hour and a half left in the workday, Samuel decided to head home early. He had a plan. Something to make the cold February evening warm and romantic. A bouquet of roses, a fine bottle of wine, and a selection of the best dishes from the Bayview Grill. The first two items, however, proved to be a bit of a challenge. Driving through the snow-covered streets of Seaford, Samuel stopped at several flower shops, only to find them closed. Most shopkeepers seemed to have decided there wouldn't be much demand for flowers in such weather. Disheartened, Samuel almost gave up until he spotted a small floral shop on a quiet corner, its lights glowing warmly against the snowy backdrop. Relieved, he parked his car and stepped inside. The shop was a fragrant haven of roses, tulips, and freshly imported mimosa, perfect for the season. With the help of a friendly salesperson, Samuel selected a beautiful bouquet of red and white roses. Leaving the shop, his heart felt light. He envisioned Clara's face lighting up when he handed her the bouquet. Despite her recent aloofness, he still wanted to rekindle the warmth in their relationship. At the Bayview Grill, Samuel picked up a few dishes prepared by their head chef, Martin, along with a bottle of champagne and a platter of fresh fruits and vegetables. Everything was perfect. When Samuel arrived home, he didn't bother ringing the doorbell. Instead, he used his key to enter quietly, savoring the thought of surprising Clara. As he stepped into the hallway, he noticed the faint sound of music drifting from the bedroom. She must be watching her shows again, he thought, smiling to himself. Carrying the bags to the kitchen, Samuel placed them on the counter. He left the bouquet in the living room, planning to present it to Clara later. Still smiling, he made his way to the bedroom, but as he opened the door, his joy evaporated. The bouquet slipped from his hand, a few petals scattering on the floor. Clara wasn't there. The bed was untouched, and the television was playing quietly, as though someone had left it on. A pang of worry gripped him. Where could she have gone in this snowstorm? He wondered. Clara wasn't a confident driver, especially in bad weather. The car. The thought struck him like lightning. If she'd gone out, there was a chance she could be in danger. Without hesitation, Samuel turned and rushed back to the hallway, his heart pounding. Samuel's mind raced as he hurried to the garage. Is the car there or not? The question consumed him. But before he could check, a news bulletin blaring from the television in the bedroom caught his attention. A foreign car has plunged off Harbor Bridge within the last half hour, the anchor announced urgently. The vehicle was reportedly driven by an inexperienced young woman. Samuel's heart stopped. Clara, it has to be her. Panic surged through him as he remembered the money he'd transferred to her just that morning for a new dress. That's why she must have gone out. Why did I ever give her that car? Throwing caution to the wind, Samuel bolted out of the house and into his car. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel, speeding toward Harbor Bridge like a man possessed. Snow and ice coated the roads, causing his tires to skid dangerously on sharp turns, but Samuel's driving experience helped him regain control each time. But Clara, she's only just started driving. His mind tormented him with thoughts of her inexperienced hands on the wheel, panic-stricken in the snowstorm. As Samuel approached within 2 miles of the bridge, disaster struck. The brakes on his car failed without warning. His foot slammed against the pedal in desperation, but the vehicle didn't respond. Faced with a life-or-death choice, he swerved sharply to avoid a collision with a parked car on the roadside. The car spun out of control, flipping multiple times before crashing into a tree. When the mangled vehicle came to a violent stop, Samuel's world blurred into darkness. The last thing he remembered was the acrid smell of gasoline leaking from the ruptured fuel tank, one spark away from disaster. Samuel awoke to the rhythmic beeping of life support machines. The sterile white walls of the hospital room loomed around him, suffocating in their brightness. Though his body remained weak and unresponsive, his mind began piecing together the chain of events. The realization hit him hard. The girl who had driven off the bridge wasn't Clara. The chaos of that evening had clouded his judgment, but now everything was clear. His wife hadn't been in danger. She had been somewhere else entirely, likely with her lover, the man she valued above all else. And then there was the will. The memory of Clara's insistence that he draft the will months ago resurfaced. At the time, it hadn't seemed suspicious. But now, in light of her betrayal, the timing felt sinister. A cold rage simmered within Samuel as he lay helpless, unable to confront her or protect himself. I won't give her the satisfaction of knowing I'm awake, he decided. Closing his eyes tightly, Samuel resolved to feign unconsciousness. When Clara visited his room later that day, Samuel felt the tension in the air as her gaze bore down on him. She loomed over the machines, keeping him alive, her fingers twitching as if tempted to press a button and end it all. Her lips thinned into a hard, straight line, and her hands visibly trembled. Samuel's heart sank. She's really considering it. Just as he felt the shadow of death's breath, the clicking of high heels echoed down the corridor. Clara froze and quickly retreated from the bedside, attempting to appear nonchalant. A moment later, the voice of the attending physician, Dr. Landry, drifted into the room. It's unbelievable, Dr. Landry said to someone outside the door. She's practically ready to bury him alive. Why would anyone marry someone so heartless? The second voice, likely a nurse, responded hesitantly. Well, they say he's the owner of the Bayview Grill, and apparently he drafted a will recently. Samuel's suspicions solidified. He recognized Clara's ruthless scheme. Dr. Landry entered the room, pausing near Samuel's bed. Strange, she remarked aloud, peering at the monitors. Some of these sensors aren't working properly. Rebecca, it's probably a malfunction. Call someone to take a look. Yes, doctor, the nurse replied, casting a glance at Samuel's prone form. Dr. Landry lingered a moment longer, then said quietly, Still, I believe he'll pull through. Sometimes miracles happen. I think he'll surprise us all. As the doctor exited, Rebecca, the nurse, began adjusting the finicky monitors. But before she could reactivate one of the devices, Samuel whispered hoarsely, Water. Please, give me water. Startled, Rebecca nearly dropped the sensor in her hand. You're awake, she exclaimed in a hushed tone, leaning closer. Samuel nodded weakly, his voice barely audible. Don't tell anyone. Not yet, especially not Clara. Rebecca's brow furrowed, but she nodded after a moment of thought. All right, I'll keep this between us for now. But you need rest. No one can know you've regained consciousness, or it'll draw attention. Samuel closed his eyes in relief as Rebecca gently moistened his lips with a damp cotton swab. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. I'll survive this, he vowed silently. Clara won't win. Rebecca set up an IV drip to replenish his nutrients. As she worked, Samuel felt tears pricking his eyes. Despite everything, someone cared enough to ensure he was comfortable. He silently vowed, Clara will not get my inheritance. I will recover, and she won't see a single penny in the divorce. Exhausted but resolved, Samuel drifted into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, Rebecca entered Dr. Landry's office and explained the situation. The doctor listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. After Rebecca finished, Dr. Landry sighed. "We won't inform his wife about his progress," she said firmly. "If I were in her position, I'd be praying for his recovery, not scheming for an inheritance. You did well, Rebecca. Thank you for your vigilance." Rebecca's face lit up with a small smile. It wasn't Samuel's appearance or status that motivated her. It was the pure desire to help someone in need. At the same time, Clara stormed into the Bayview Grill, seizing control of the restaurant. Her fiery red hair and sharp demeanor struck fear into the staff. 3 weeks had passed since Samuel's accident, and she had wasted no time asserting herself. Her gaze swept coldly across the team, indifferent to their discomfort. The first target of her wrath was Martin, the head chef. "Mrs. Whitaker," Martin began carefully, "the quality of ingredients is crucial to the final result. The dishes require—" "I don't care," Clara snapped, cutting him off. "You'll do as I say. From now on, we'll cut costs wherever possible. If you can't handle that, go find a job at some roadside diner. I'm sure your talents will be appreciated there." Martin flushed with humiliation but lowered his head. "Understood, Mrs. Whitaker." From the corner of the room, Leo, the administrator, watched with amusement. He preferred Clara's aggressive style over Samuel's empathetic management. As Clara finished berating Martin, Leo stepped forward with a suggestion. "Mrs. Whitaker, may I make a recommendation? For maximum efficiency, you should consider installing hidden surveillance cameras to monitor the staff." Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Surveillance cameras? Are there any here already?" Leo continued explaining with pride. The cameras were rarely used under Mr. Whitaker's leadership. He only turned them on in extreme cases. Most of the time they stayed off because he trusted the staff. But after the accident, I've kept them running. It's easy to see who's performing well and who's taking advantage of his absence. Clara's lips curled into a satisfied smirk. "Excellent work, Leo. These cameras will be invaluable. Unlike Samuel's lax approach, I intend to ensure this place runs exactly as I say. Such tricks won't work with me." Her praise brought a smug smile to Leo's face. A few minutes later, Clara sat in the office, eagerly reviewing the recordings from the previous day. Initially, everything seemed normal. The waitresses moved efficiently through the dining area, the head chef commanded the kitchen with precision, and the host greeted customers warmly. Then Clara's sharp eyes caught something. Rosa, the dishwasher, was captured on video carrying a bulky bag as she left. "Well, look at her," Clara sneered. "What's in that bag, I wonder? Is she cleaning out the fridge, taking food home? And all this right under Samuel's nose. Foolish man." Her interest piqued. Clara decided she would confront Rosa directly. Rosa, unaware of the surveillance or Clara's plans, went about her day as usual. She had long since gotten permission from Samuel to take home untouched leftovers, a small but meaningful gesture of kindness that helped her support her children. But today, everything changed. As Rosa neared the exit, carrying a canvas bag filled with food approved by the head chef, Clara stepped into her path, blocking the doorway. "And where do you think you're going, dear?" Clara said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "Carrying a bag full of delicacies, I see, planning to just waltz out of here with it?" Rosa froze, clutching the bag tightly. She looked at Clara with wide, terrified eyes, her expression a mixture of shock and despair. "I am sorry, Mrs. Whitaker," Rosa stammered. "I haven't stolen anything. These are just leftovers. Food the customers didn't touch, I swear." Clara's sneer deepened. "Leftovers, you say? And who decided that? You perhaps? How convenient. Let's take a look, shall we?" She reached into Rosa's bag and pulled out a container. "Oh, a Caesar salad, half-eaten but still quite gourmet. My, you have excellent taste." Tears welled in Rosa's eyes as Clara mocked her. She had least expected this kind of treatment over something Samuel himself had approved. "Don't cry now," Clara said coldly. "Your crocodile tears won't work on me. You can save them for after you've lost your job." Rosa sniffled and began emptying the bag, her hands trembling. The cruelest part was that she had already paid for the food using her future wages, a deduction the head chef had approved. Now she was being accused of theft. Leo, ever the opportunist, approached with a smirk. "Well, it seems we've caught a little fish in our net. Fitting, don't you think, Mrs. Whitaker?" Clara exchanged a meaningful glance with Leo, her tone turning even harsher. What's your excuse, Rosa? Let me guess. It's for your children? Rosa's voice cracked as she tried to explain. It is. I have 4 kids at home to feed, 2 of my own and 2 from my late husband's first marriage. They're all mine now. I don't have much, but Clara interrupted, her voice icy. I couldn't care less how many children you have, 3, 4, or 10. That's your problem. You chose to have them, so you deal with it. Leo added smugly, her husband's in prison too, tried to use the kids to get a reduced sentence, but Rosa managed to revoke his rights. Rosa's tears spilled over as she whispered, They're my family. All I want is to take care of them. But Clara's face remained stony. Enough of your sob story. You're fired. Take your things and get out of my restaurant. And don't expect a final paycheck. We'll be deducting it to cover the damages. Despair etched across Rosa's face as she clutched her empty bag. Without another word, she turned and walked out into the cold, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, tears stinging her eyes and her cheeks flushed from both humiliation and the biting cold. From his post near the restaurant, Walter, the janitor, noticed Rosa's trembling shoulders and couldn't stand idly by. He approached her gently. Shh, dear, don't cry. Don't torment yourself over this, sunshine, he said kindly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Leo's just riding high because he's in Clara's favor. That's why he's doing whatever he wants. But mark my words, when Mr. Whitaker recovers, his reign will come to an end. And about the money, don't worry. I'll lend you some from my pension to tide you over. Pay me back whenever you can, no rush. Rosa looked at him with tear-filled eyes. Thank you, Walter. You've always been so kind. I was counting on this paycheck so much. We're barely scraping by as it is. The kids and I are in a rented apartment, and the landlady keeps raising the rent, saying I can handle it because of the child benefits, but she has no idea. Walter shook his head in sympathy. You're a good woman, Rosa. Calm, hard-working, never a bad word about anyone. And you've had to endure so much. Don't let them break you. He remembered Leo from years ago. Back then, Walter had been a craft teacher at the local high school, where Leo had been an arrogant, troublemaking student. Walter had tried to guide him, but Leo had always bullied those weaker than him and never took responsibility for his actions. Walter thought back to the night the school's craft workshop burned down. Many blamed Walter, claiming he'd been careless with a cigarette, but Walter had never smoked and was meticulous about fire safety. Later, the truth came out. Leo and his friends had set the fire. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence to hold him accountable. The incident ultimately ended Walter's teaching career, but he didn't dwell on the past. Now, years later, fate had brought him and Leo back together, albeit in very different roles. And while Leo pretended not to recognize his old teacher, Walter had no illusions about who he was dealing with. By contrast, Samuel had earned Walter's respect. Honest, kind, and fair, Samuel was the kind of leader people were proud to work for. Clutching the money Walter had given her, Rosa began the cold walk to the bus stop, trying to ignore the biting frost and the dirty gray snow piled along the street. Her thoughts swirled as she trudged along, weighed down by the day's events. Suddenly, a muffled noise caught her attention. Startled, Rosa turned, thinking Walter might have followed her to say something. But when she looked behind her, there was no one there. The sound repeated, soft but persistent, and she froze, her breath visible in the crisp winter air. Rosa realized the sound was coming from a nearby snowdrift. Someone clearly needed help. She cautiously approached and froze in shock. Lying in the dirty gray snow was a man with a bloody head, groaning softly and barely conscious. At first, Rosa thought the stranger might have been drunk and fallen, hitting his head. But as she leaned closer, it became clear he was sober. Without hesitation, Rosa slipped her arms under his and tried to lift him to his feet. The man groaned as he started to regain consciousness, the initial shock of his injury wearing off. Damn, how could this happen? Don't touch Jack, the man muttered, his words disjointed and delirious. Straining under his weight, Rosa half-dragged, half-carried him toward Walter's shed. The injured man seemed like a vagabond who had likely been left to freeze in the bitter cold. When Walter saw Rosa's flushed face and her burden, he immediately understood. Without a word, he rushed to help, grabbing the man's other side. Together, they managed to lay him on an old folding cot in the shed. Well, that's better, Walter said, sighing as he fetched a first aid kit. Let's clean that wound on his head. He should recover soon enough. Shouldn't we call an ambulance? Rosa asked anxiously. Walter shook his head. No need, dear. No point in distracting them from more serious emergencies. I always wanted to be a doctor, you know. Took the entrance exams but didn't make it. Went to nursing school instead, but luck wasn't on my side there either. Ended up working as a laborer. But I still know how to provide first aid. Don't worry, this lad's tough. He'll pull through. Rosa smiled faintly as the wounded man stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He groaned and turned his head, disoriented, but slowly coming back to his senses. Easy there, buddy. No sudden movements, Walter said gently. Just lie still and let yourself recover. Can you at least tell us your name? The man smiled weakly, his voice hoarse but steady. Wanor Sawyer. Got into trouble over a dog. Rich kids wanted to have some fun. Picked on a stray. Jack's his name. He lives near the meat market, fearless little guy. I couldn't just stand by, so I stepped in. Took 2 of them down, but the third hit me over the head with something. Walter nodded sympathetically. Yeah, these things happen. Don't worry, you're safe here. Stay as long as you need. I've got firewood and a stove. You'll be warm and comfortable. Wanor turned his gaze to Rosa, gratitude shining in his tired eyes. Thank you for not passing me by. Rosa glanced at her watch and sighed. Well, looks like I'll have to take a taxi now. There go my savings. I've already missed the bus. Wanor's face clouded with guilt. He turned his head to the wall and muttered. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to mess things up for you. I've been having quite the adventures lately. 3 weeks ago, I pulled a guy out of a burning car. Maybe you heard about it. It made the news. Rosa froze, her heart skipping a beat. Her hand instinctively clenched as she remembered the strange vision she'd had about Samuel. Walter raised an eyebrow. We heard about that. That was Samuel Whitaker, the restaurant owner. Rosa and I used to work for him, but, well, we don't anymore. Rosa looked down at her hands, thinking about how intertwined their lives had unexpectedly become. I just happened to be there, Wanor replied modestly. It's not even my usual spot. See, we drifters have our own territories, our own rules. You step onto someone else's turf, and you'll have your ribs cracked before you know it. But that day, I saw the accident, saw the smoke rising, and something in me just couldn't walk away. Walter listened intently, his respect for the young man growing by the second. Deep down, he already knew Wanor had a good heart. A man who would defend a stray dog wouldn't think twice about risking his life for a stranger. Wanor touched the wound on his temple gingerly, then continued his story. I ran to the car. The gas tank was already leaking. It could have gone up at any moment. People were standing around screaming, but no one was doing anything. I couldn't just leave the guy to burn alive. I found a rock, smashed the window, and started pulling him out. The noise, the panic, everything around me was chaos. But I got him far enough away, about 30 feet, and then it exploded. Walter's expression turned somber. You're a real hero, my friend, throwing yourself into a fire for someone you didn't even know. Not many would do that. Rosa glanced at Wanor warmly. She couldn't help but think that everything, their meeting, his rescue of Samuel, her own role in saving Wanor, was somehow interconnected. It was becoming harder to dismiss these events as mere coincidences. But Rosa couldn't linger any longer. She called a taxi and headed home, where her 4 hungry children, Nathan, Anna, Peter, and Emily, were waiting. Meanwhile, Samuel lay in his hospital bed, slowly regaining strength. Although his body was still weak, barely able to lift a fork or spoon, his mind was sharper than ever. Rebecca and Dr. Landry had skillfully kept Clara in the dark about Samuel's improving condition for 5 days. Clara, fully intent on disconnecting him from life support and claiming her inheritance, had no idea her plans were unraveling. On the 5th day, Samuel called Rebecca over. He looked at her with determination and whispered, I need your help. I need to leave, just for a short while. Please, you have to understand. Rebecca stared at him incredulously. Mr. Whitaker, are you serious? Less than a week ago, you were in a coma. You can barely stand. What if something happens? What am I supposed to do? Go to court for negligence? Desperation filled Samuel's eyes. Please, Rebecca, be human. I'll sign whatever documents you need, releasing the clinic from all responsibility. But I need this. Rebecca hesitated, torn between her professional duty and her growing sympathy for him. She had seen Clara's coldness firsthand, her rush to rid herself of her husband without a shred of remorse. Finally, Rebecca sighed. "Fine, I'll help, but only if I come with you. It'll be safer for both of us. We'll go in the evening, a couple of hours before lights out." Samuel nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, but let's keep this between us. Not even Dr. Landry should know. No one." Rebecca agreed and began gathering the essentials. Emergency medications, a walking stick borrowed from another patient, and anything else that might help. As she prepared, Samuel lay in bed, summoning his strength for the plan he'd been forming in his mind for days. His thoughts drifted to Rosa, the only person who had warned him about the danger he would face. She was right, he thought bitterly. And now, I have to make this right. His thoughts turned bitter as he reflected on Clara. She's something else entirely. A lover and my assets? That's her game. But I'll settle this, no question about it. Not with her ruthless methods, but in my own way. Determined, Samuel closed his eyes and resumed pretending to be comatose. Time dragged on until Rebecca finally entered the ward, carrying a set of clean clothes. "Here, these belong to my ex-husband. We've been divorced for years, but he never bothered to take them. I think they'll fit you," she said with a warm smile. Samuel changed as quickly as his battered body would allow, leaning heavily against the bed for support. Every movement was exhausting, his injuries from the accident still taking their toll. Rebecca watched him closely, ready to steady him if needed. As they made their way out, Samuel had to stop every few hundred feet to catch his breath. Rebecca, understanding his condition, kept their journey as short as possible. She had even arranged for a private driver, someone discreet who didn't ask questions about the weary man with the walking stick. When they arrived at Samuel's home, anxiety washed over him like a cold wave. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as he stepped out of the car, the frosty wind biting at his face. Rebecca looked at him with concern, but she knew there was no stopping him now. Samuel approached the door, shivering slightly. His keys had been with him at the time of the accident, along with his wallet and phone. Inserting the key into the lock, he twisted it, only to find it wouldn't turn. "She changed the locks," Samuel muttered bitterly, slipping the useless key back into his pocket. "She's adapted to the new reality quickly, I must admit." He pressed the doorbell, and the cheerful melody he once loved rang out. Rebecca stood to the side, waiting silently. Footsteps echoed from within the house, growing louder until the door finally swung open. Standing there was Clara's lover, a sturdy man wrapped in Samuel's bathrobe, a gift from his late mother. Seeing the man wearing something so personal without a trace of shame sent a wave of fury through Samuel. For a moment Samuel froze, his gaze burning into the man's. "Who's there, darling?" Clara's familiar, languid voice floated from deeper inside the house. "Not the utilities again, I hope. I've paid everything for the month so we could relax at the resort." Samuel's fists clenched painfully at her words, his knuckles white around the handle of his cane. When Clara entered the doorway and saw him, her face drained of color. Without hesitation she dropped to her knees, her voice trembling. "Samuel, please, let me explain. It's not what it looks like. I swear, I thought you only had a few days left. The doctors said they didn't give any hope. Miracles don't happen. Do they?" Grinding his teeth, Samuel stared down at her. His voice was cold, filled with steel resolve. "You have 5 minutes to pack your things and leave this house." Clara's lover straightened his shoulders, puffing up with false bravado. "Listen, unfinished businessman," he sneered. "Go get yourself treated and stop interfering with normal people's lives. Honestly, it's a shame you didn't crash for good back then." The man's words ignited something within Samuel. He tightened his grip on the cane until his fingers ached, leaning forward with quiet fury. "You won't have to wait long to regret this," Samuel growled. "You thought you'd buried me alive, but I survived, against all odds. And now I'll make sure the truth about that accident comes out." At the mention of the accident, the man's confidence shattered. He shrank back, avoiding Samuel's piercing gaze, and retreated into the house to change out of the bathrobe. As for Clara, her rainbow illusion of a perfect new life dissolved in an instant. Samuel's return marked the abrupt end of her scheming, and she knew it. And now, It was time for Samuel to take back control and seek justice for everything Clara had done. Though he couldn't directly prove her involvement in the car accident, he knew how to hit her where it hurt. He systematically cut off her access to his wealth, blocking her credit cards and freezing all her accounts. Once, Samuel had pulled Clara out of provincial obscurity, giving her every opportunity to transform into a successful businesswoman. But after her betrayal, forgiveness was out of the question. Years ago, Samuel had even saved Clara from criminal prosecution for fraud, believing her innocence. In truth, she had always been a cunning schemer, focused solely on enriching herself. Now, with new evidence and a renewed sense of purpose, Samuel contacted the investigator assigned to Clara's past case. "I want it reopened and thoroughly investigated," he stated firmly. Clara, realizing her schemes were crumbling, panicked. In a moment of desperation, she grabbed a heavy vase and lunged at Samuel, aiming to strike him. But Rebecca was quick to act. The nurse intercepted Clara's hand mid-swing, wresting the vase away before it could cause harm. At that exact moment, the sound of tires screeching outside signaled the arrival of law enforcement. Several police officers in plain clothes, armed and ready, stormed into the house. For Clara and her lover, the game was over. Samuel, meanwhile, watched as Clara was handcuffed and led away. His expression wasn't triumphant, only deeply saddened. The weight of exhaustion overtook him, and his knees buckled. Rebecca caught him just in time, gently helping him sink to the ground. Without her, he might have fallen into a coma again. The next morning, Samuel awoke in his hospital bed. This time, the voices he heard weren't Clara scheming over his will, but the warm, familiar tones of people he trusted. Walter, Rosa, and Wanor were gathered near his bed, their faces lighting up as he stirred awake. As Samuel's vision focused, he recognized Wanor immediately, the man who had pulled him from the burning car. Wanor, embracing Rosa by the shoulders, hesitated before explaining. "I've been keeping a low profile. Didn't want too much attention after the rescue. It's not my style, but I had to come see you." Samuel listened intently, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You saved my life, Wanor. That's something I'll never forget." As the conversation continued, Samuel couldn't help but feel inspired. Wanor, with his bravery and loyalty, would make a remarkable manager for the Bayview Grill. Samuel was certain of it. Rosa, too, had proven herself countless times through her hard work and perseverance. She deserved a promotion, perhaps to assistant chef or even a leadership role in the kitchen. Whatever she chose, Samuel was ready to make it happen. But first, there was something more pressing in Samuel's heart. He turned to Rebecca, the nurse who had stood by him through every trial, and reached for her hand. "Rebecca," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "None of this would have been possible without you. I owe you my life and my heart." Tears shimmered in Rebecca's eyes as she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Yes, Samuel, I will. But promise me one thing, stay out of hospitals from now on." The room erupted into applause and laughter. Even Wanor, usually reserved, winked at Rosa and added, "Looks like a season of happy endings, doesn't it? Who knows, maybe I'll be the father of 4 or 5 someday." Rosa blushed, but the warmth in her eyes was undeniable. With mutual respect, love, and hope for the future, everything seemed to fall into place. Weddings, growing families, and the joyful laughter of children awaited them all. Top of form, bottom of form.